and welcome to the 2020 edition of Esquire Neighbourhood. My name is Mitchell Oakley-Smith. I'm the editor-in-chief of Esquire Singapore, and it's my honour to be hosting this panel discussion today as part of Esquire Neighbourhood, titled "Photography in the Age of Instagram." And I'm really glad to welcome some of my favourite photographers and some of my favourite collaborators as well to this. So, first of all, we have Lee Keat, or better known as YK. Nice to have you.
Thanks. Hi. Nice to see you all, guys. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. We also have Margaret Zhang, who is currently in Sydney, although is typically globally roaming. Thanks for being here, Margaret.
No worries. Happy to be here.
And from Melbourne, Tom Blatchford. Hey.
Hey, how you guys doing?
Thanks, everyone. Now, the discussion today is really about what the role of a photographer is in the 21st century, because in this era when amateur iPhone snaps can garner millions of likes, we've really started to, I guess, question or wonder what the role of a photographer is and how this professional art form has evolved to serve our social media feeds. So we're going to jump into that topic and learn how the lines, I guess, between social media and photography are dissolving, and what the future holds for the camera. So I might actually just start with you, YK. You're a self-taught photographer, and I'm curious to know what it was that drew you to pick up a camera and how you sort of went about learning how to use it and perfecting your craft.
Right. So for me, I started everything about I would say 7 or 8 years ago, and I didn't start with a camera on hand. It was with my phone. So it was, I dabbled on it for about 2 to 3 years before getting my first camera. So the reason why I got a camera is because back then I got really curious into night photography, which back then, older phones can't really do much at night. So that was my reason that I picked it up, and then I learned everything from down to the very technical settings, all online, and it's all self-taught. And I didn't go to art school. Side note, I studied in aerospace, which is very different from what I do now. So yeah, that's just quick journey of how I got my first camera.
And Margaret, for you, what has your process been? I guess transitioning from working in front of the camera to behind it. Has it been a trial and error process, learning and perfecting your craft?
Yeah, it's interesting because I learned photography on film and not shooting human subjects. And so the process of understanding how to engage with human subjects was something that I picked up from working in front of camera. And certainly in the earlier stages of my career, that definitely accelerated the learning process, being able to be in front of camera and behind camera and collaborate with people who playing different roles in a crew, or different photographers who have very different styles of lighting or ways of engaging with their subjects. I think that was actually super important to me in my career personally.
Yeah. And Tom, you studied marketing at university, right?
Yeah. I was enrolled in marketing.
Right.
I didn't do much study.
How did you get to photography to where you are now?
I decided to get a camera for my birthday, for my 20th birthday, and I picked it up, and it just felt right. It was just the only thing that I'd ever really been passionate about, just exploring the technical side. I'd always been kind of a nerd, and so I loved technology, and I had this kind of little Japanese computer, that took photos. So I started to learn that. And then I deferred my studies to go and assist some photographers. And so I worked for about 5 years assisting. But I'm kind of jealous of experience as just being in front of the camera, because I feel like assisting is 99% schlepping and like 2%, 1% learning stuff. I feel like I just wanted to walk into the room and like clock the lighting setup and walk out is what I would have loved to have done. But yeah, I kind of went down that conventional path of assisting and then made the jump from there.
Yeah. And Margaret, going back to that, I mean, how does that approach, do you think, define or influence your photographic process? I mean, you know, combining those different roles of photographer and model and creative director, you know, it really, I imagine, has such an impact on the final product.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see a set as deeply collaborative, as I think all of us would. And I think the benefit of me working across different roles, it gives you a really deep appreciation for how difficult each of those roles can be in different circumstances, whether you're in a studio setting or on location. And each kind of rotating between each makes me stronger at the rest and gives you, first of all, more empathy to, you know, the pressures of other roles on set, but also allows you to zoom in and out accordingly. So you can kind of take a step back and see the full picture, see what's going on with everybody on set, and then kind of hone in on where there might be an issue or the kind of more granular adjustments that need to happen in order to get an image that you want. So I've always really appreciated being able to learn and grow on all fronts in order to hone the craft per se.
Yeah, I think it definitely would. And YK, I just wanted to go back as well to that point that you mentioned earlier, just how you initially learned photography on your phone. You know, I think probably many photographers or art critics, you know, might sort of dismiss phones as not being true to the art form. But, you know, even today, you know, I've been seeing that you're showcasing small tutorials on Instagram stories about, you know, using different settings and features. I mean, what's your take on the whole kind of iPhone versus real camera debate?
I think nowadays it's even more blurred due to like the pandemic. People just you know, when they have a lot of time, they try to dabble into photography, and first thing they come you know, think of that is use something that they always have, which is our phones. So I think in general, thinking about phone versus camera, you know, the people always say gear, the gear doesn't matter, but yeah, to me it matters it only at this analogy of like, you know, if you're going to cut a fruit, any knife will cut a fruit. It's just which kind of knife cuts better and cuts way faster. So I would say like a digital camera is kind of like a very sharp knife, and the iPhone, it's like or any other mobile phone, it's like a less sharper knife, but they both do the job. It's just, you know, if you really want to learn photography, the gear itself shouldn't limit you.
Yeah, and Margaret, I mean, do you take any of the work that you publish across your different platforms on a phone, or do you sort of strictly use a professional camera and then transfer it across?
It's definitely a mix. Photographs that I take of people are generally taken on my camera, and any kind of mise-en-scène stuff or landscapes or just scenes that are just my perspective on the world and the day is often taken on my phone because it's convenient. Either that or a small point and shoot film camera that I have. So yeah, I definitely agree with YK in that those boundaries are really blurred, and it's more so what you make of it. That said, there are so many limitations with phone photography. It's really heavily dependent on lighting. And so I think we would all agree that it's a bit misleading to say that you could create, you know, the quality of anything you could shoot on a professional camera on a phone, because there are so many variables that you can't control. But yeah, I think it's great though that anybody would be able to explore that, because previously I think there was a huge barrier to entry to the industry or the profession because of how expensive it was to develop film or how expensive DSLRs were. So yeah, I think it's great.
Mm. And of course, you all use social media, obviously in different ways, but you know, Instagram or TikTok to publish your work and you know, have amassed really significant followings. How much does the engagement or say the responses that you receive on social media kind of shape and inform, you know, future shoots? Do you sort of do you take that all on board when you are sort of conceiving different projects and think, well, you know, this style or this type of lighting or this coloring tends to be more popular, so I'll skew my work that way? I mean, Mark, is that something that comes up, you know, in your thought process?
Not so much for me. I think people might find it surprising that I don't spend very much time on social media personally. Have a lot of other things to do. So yeah, I try not to just have that much screen time in my day, because I think it takes away from, you know, human interactions and observation of real world situations that can actually give you that creative energy to or stimulus to actually want to go shoot something or create something or write something, whatever it is. But I think the community component of social media is really important to me, and being able to communicate with people who've supported my work for a really long time from a really young age is really special to me. And for them to be able to see my personal evolution professionally, I think is something that it's quite phenomenal that you're able to have that when you think about it, to communicate with people from parts of the world that you've never even been.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I imagine for you, Tom, that would in some cases be something that you think about, you know, that element of community, because you're shooting these different series in, say, Venice or Tokyo. So to kind of engage with people or receive feedback or a response from people that have a connection to those places must be a super...
I can also organize. Sorry, I was going to say I can. It's also just been phenomenal for organizing things. Like, you know, I was in Kazakhstan last year and just put a post up like, "Hey, is anyone in Kazakhstan that wants to go? Anyone in Almaty that wants to go for a drink tonight?" And hooked up with a really great photographer who kind of, you know, got me into the scene. So, you know, and then in some of my Palm Springs shoots, I'm looking for vintage cars, and you know, where do you find people that own a, you know, collection of vintage Porsches? But I just kind of put a message out there and it kind of delivers. So that's just been crazy for me to be able to get under the skin of places just by putting up a post.
Mm. Yeah, I think, and that, to that same question, you know, do you think that the way that your work is received on social media influences it in any way in the future, or you kind of try and find a separation between, you know, the audience appreciation or feedback and what it is you have in mind?
Yeah, I think I take note. I think since Instagram changed their algorithm a little bit, it's kind of hard to gauge feedback. I kind of can't compare something to something I posted 3 years ago, because you know, the landscape's changed a little bit in terms of how people interact. And but yeah, I think it's nice to see what people are liking. I don't think it stops me going to shoot stuff, but I think it does sink in somewhere. I try not to let it influence too much. Like I'm about to release a new series of Tokyo stuff, and I'm posting it all on Instagram now first. I don't think that if nobody likes something, I'm going to take it out of the series, but it's nice to know whether my gut instincts about what I think the hero shots were right or not.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting about it as well is that, you know, in the past, say if you had in mind to shoot something like a series of Tokyo, or really any series that any of you have worked on, you might have had to wait for a magazine commission, or to have a professional website or some outlet to publish it. But I imagine that using social media as an actual publication device is quite freeing. Would you agree, YK?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, social media is so powerful, and also it's like a double-edged sword for a lot of us. It's you have a responsibility to post whatever you want, and also you know, if like for me, most of my works are all posted on social media and websites. So I'm heavily responsible for each and everything that I put out there. I have to double check, triple check everything. So it's really powerful, but then it gets you thinking of like, you have to give a second thought, like, will this affect certain culture that you have never thought about, so it makes you ponder upon for a longer duration.
I definitely agree that I see social media as a space where you have total control, which is, like YK said, this blessing and a curse. But I do kind of see it as that control in an experiment per se, where this is where your work is purely yours. Whereas if you're working on projects with other people or with a publication or with a brand, for example, there are a lot more opinions and a lot more variables in that environment. Whereas social media can be treated as a great portfolio piece where you're able to present yourself the way that you would want to be seen or the way you want your work to be seen. But there's also kind of format challenges around that too, because, sometimes the work that I do, particularly the motion work that I do, or a lot of artists that I've worked with have said the same thing, where, the small square or the small screen is not necessarily the best format in which to experience a piece of still photography, for instance.
Yeah, and Margaret, just what you're talking about, working with brands or commercial clients. I mean, how do you sort of approach a project like that so that you are fulfilling the brief, for example, but you're still bringing Margaret Chang to that project and to that what that final image is?
I think the older I've gotten, the more that I understand that it's really about that relationship and the trust between the client and the creator. I always prefer to build the brief with all the parties involved, and it varies from just the one point person at a brand all the way through to many of the agencies and many of the art directors. And you can never really find that balance either as the client or the creative if you're not able to workshop that direction together. And I feel like that comes down to what are you trying to say, who are you trying to speak to, rather than just working off a PDF brief that you might get, and just asking those extra questions and kind of having some more in-depth discussions about the landscape and the market and the demographic that you're targeting. That's all really helpful, so that there's this you're building a rapport with the client. Although that said, I do feel like because of the consulting work that I do, also I have the luxury of having those earlier conversations that a lot of photographers maybe don't always get to be in those rooms early on.
Yeah, because I mean, Tom, for you, some of these series that you've been doing in different cities around the world are personal projects, but then some have had some kind of commercial element to them or support behind them. Do you think it changes the approach, or it's more about just finding sort of a happy balance so that your aesthetic is still really prevalent?
For me, I don't think it changes my approach, or at least I kind of try and set those boundaries with clients that I'll do it, but only if they'll just support me doing what I want to do. But then I think it probably does, once they get involved in the kind of selection process, I find that I need a really long time from shooting work to editing it to be able to really kind of see clearly what I was going for, because I'm so kind of in this weird frantic exploration scouting mode, usually running over a city for a week. So I find that, maybe the client will come in and help me to do an edit, and it will sort of go in that direction of their story. And then once I've had, 6 months to think about it, that I'll be able to refine it more towards what I wanted. But yeah, I always try and set pretty clear boundaries that I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'll have that product sitting on my hard drive, and what I wanted, and it's just how long it takes me to get to my sort of distillation of whatever it was I was going for.
Yeah, and I guess in so many cases, I mean, really for all of you, once you've established a quite identifiable aesthetic, I guess clients are coming to you for that, not because they want you to to be someone else, or for the work to look like something else. I wanted to ask about your different city series, Tom, like Venice and Tokyo, you know, which I guess are so well known for making quite cinematic moments, you know, from the everyday or every night, really, because so much of this is shot at night, and you know, just using the different available light. I mean, what is it that draws you to this nocturnal atmosphere?
I don't know. I think I've always been nocturnal. I used to, you know, before Netflix on YouTube, I used to stay up watching infomercials till 3 in the morning because I just hated going to bed. I still hate going to bed, and I hate getting up as well. It's a strange place to be in. But yeah, I guess that for me was the magic when I picked up a camera that in many ways, if you try and use a camera to take a photo of a sunset, you get a disappointing version of it. Our eyes and our brains are so much better at seeing a scene like that than a camera is. But then I found at night that this camera was like this crazy bridge to this other world that was in front of me, but I couldn't quite see it, that cameras could keep drinking in light where my brain would stop and I would see darkness, but my camera could see light, it could see color, could see contrast, and all these things that would just beyond my perception. So I kind of fell in love with that thing where I would use my camera and I'd be standing there in the darkness, barely seeing, and then it'd pop up on the back of the screen. And I almost had no idea what was in front of me, you know, before I saw it through the camera. So that kind of dialogue with my camera of using it to augment my senses is something that I've become pretty obsessed with.
And your work has been noted for, I guess, your embrace or use of long exposure. Tell us, you know, about this process and what it is that it helps you achieve in your image making process.
Yeah, it's interesting. Long exposure kind of, I think photography is really amazing and has always captivated people when it can shift time. We experience time in a completely linear way, but you know, from the first photos that showed a bullet going through an apple or a horse, you know, running with all its legs in the air, long exposure does the opposite. It compresses 30 seconds or a minute into one moment. And I think that's, you know, like I was saying before, that lets you not only see colors and see contrast and see into the darkness that our brains can't comprehend, but it also lets you kind of condense this moment or this kind of length of time into one single moment. So you've got stars moving, and that's very confusing to people. People often see my photos of Palm Springs where the stars are moving and say, why are the stars moving? And I kind of have to explain that the stars aren't moving, we're moving, that, you know, the earth is spinning at 200,000 miles an hour. And it's kind of this, you know, it can kind of cause this little existential crisis. So yeah, I just really like being able to use the camera to compress time and to be able to extend our senses. Yeah, that's really fascinating for me.
Yeah, and as you say there, it feels as though you're moving. And, you know, when you look at those images, or there is this sense of movement.
Yeah.
And Margaret, I mean, you've been working in moving image as well as with still photography, and you've created a short film, and you're working on a feature film. What would you say are the greatest differences or greatest similarities between cinematography and photography?
I guess the storytelling component is really important. That said, I feel like my stills work and why I wanted to move beyond stills work into motion is because most of my stills work was more about a move and a moment in time, kind of like what Tom was talking about, and more of a scene or more of a character and about the relationship with the subject. And so I guess the good thing about directing motion is that you can zoom out and have a look at all of the components that are required to build out a scene and a character and to make people feel something. In that, you know, in film, you have that luxury of having audio visual stimulus and having movement in fabrics or movement in character and cadence of dialogue to capture audience emotion, whereas in stills, you're really depending on that moment in time and the individual interpretation of something. And not to say one is any better than the other, but it's definitely a more exhaustive medium, I suppose.
Yeah, and is it exhausting in the sense of the amount there is for you to do as a producer of these of this imagery? I mean, in terms of you're not just shooting something still, but moving, and then you do, as you say, have these other components like audio. You know, I imagine that process is to learn and to perfect must be quite a technical challenge.
There's definitely more room for error, for sure. And it's very difficult to stop. I think with photographs, you know when you have the image that you want to have to a degree, whereas with motion, because there are so many factors, and as a human being, you can only kind of gauge what's going on to a degree, especially when you have this like piecemeal team. And yes, you're interacting with them, but only they know how good of a take that they got for a scene, for instance. So making that judgment call of to move on is quite difficult, but you know, that's the fun of it, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, hey, I mean, you have skill for capturing people in a really authentic way. And I think this was really evident in your tour photography for Laos, for example. And certainly, you know, profile-wise, just it's such an incredible experience, I imagine. I mean, what was that whole tour like?
I think in like touring, when people think about being a tour photographer, is they think like, oh, it's like you must be like, you know, super hectic and like getting all the biggest moments. But actually, after touring for an entire year, I prefer the opposite, which I have been, you know, learning a lot about it. I like actually taking more intimate moments, and being a tour photographer, you are the only person that has the power to see both sides, the artist itself and the super intimate side of him or her, versus the crazy chaotic energy from the crowd itself. So you kind of also have a responsibility to produce the images that that doesn't cross the fine line of like invading their privacy and showing their vulnerability to the audience. There's just this really fine line, and I love that. I love to document people in general, whether on the streets or high profile artists. So documenting is always the number one reason why I got into tour photography. And also the experience, of course, it was very hectic and it was really crazy. Every day it's a different city, but once you get the hang of it, you kind of like zone in and you kind of know like, oh, when is the best time to take certain shots for different scenarios.
And Margaret, I know that this reminded me of something that you were talking about earlier, you know, that your background, you know, working, say, in front of the camera has helped you develop your approach or your technique to photography in terms of interacting with the subject and, you know, making someone feel comfortable in front of the camera. I mean, is that, I think that's quite an underestimated skill for a photographer, you know, to be able to make someone feel comfortable or to draw out their most authentic self or convey something about that person's personality. I mean, do you think that's sort of a lifelong journey as a photographer?
Yeah, I think the interpersonal skills that photographers who photograph people need to have, depending on the style that you do, obviously, is really generally underestimated. I will say that none of my sets are silent, obviously, and it's just as much about the relationships that you have with people around you behind camera as it is about your relationship with the person that you're photographing. You know, it's always a live conversation and always checking in and making sure that they're fine. And I think I'm hypersensitive to that because I have been in awkward positions, front of camera, or uncomfortable environments. And so I would never want other people to go through that. So I think that's definitely a benefit of having had that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we've seen such a reckoning in the photography industry over the past few years, you know, with so many questions raised in light of Me Too, and this has been traditionally a male-dominated industry, particularly in that fashion circle. You know, there's throughout history, there's just been, you know, men shooting, say, campaigns or editorials of women that are aimed at women. But I think that a female photographer, and thankfully, you know, I think we're seeing a change where we're seeing more female fashion photographers. Not that there ever weren't that many, but seeing their work being published in a larger way is really promising. But you know, I think there is something to be said about the approach that a female would bring to a fashion shoot. I mean, do you see that in your own work?
Yeah, I think it's also about the female perspective of a team, right? Like, if a female photographer is shooting to a brief that is written or put together by a male gaze, then there's a conflict there and it isn't necessarily super productive. And so I think what people underestimate about representation, whether that's with women, whether that's with young people, whether that's with other minorities, people of color, etc., is that it's not just about having that one person on set or the person in front of camera or just the photographer or just the stylist. Like, it really comes from a collective effort. And not to say that, I mean, often I work on all female sets and I get overwhelmingly positive feedback on that, particularly when I'm shooting female subjects who are not accustomed to that. But I think it's great that we're taking more of a collectivist approach rather than kind of deifying this model muse kind of photographer and their muse, or artist and their muse relationship that, you know, in many ways is the crux of a lot of uncomfortable issues and problems that has kind of started this reckoning, I suppose, in the industry.
Right. And do you think that, you know, we were talking before about how things like iPhones have made it possible for people to explore or, you know, try or experiment with photography, you know, which was typically, you know, quite an expensive or difficult industry to come into. But do you think that has also helped open it up to more women, you know, to this industry that has typically been quite male?
Yeah, and I think as well, not even just as far as the equipment, but also the route to becoming a professional photographer, like what Tom was talking about before, as the traditional way of becoming a photographer was always to assist another photographer who, you know, most likely was male, who has many male assistants, and being the one woman in that environment would probably not be the most comfortable or greatest learning experience necessarily. And so for women to be able to have alternate paths to reach that same result or same goal of, you know, shooting particular editorial titles or shooting particular commercial work, I think has really helped so that it's not so limiting.
Yeah, definitely. And Tom, your book Midnight Modern, obviously that was a series before it came a book, and I'm just curious about what the process is of creating or transforming your work, you know, from an image to a monograph. I mean, and what it is that makes that final result so special as a photographer to you know, have it printed in hardback as, you know, an object.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience. It was quite difficult. I guess being a digital photographer, and then, you know, a digital photographer who sometimes prints some images using a kind of inkjet fine art, you know, Epson, RGB world, and then going to CMYK print large run stuff is really different. And quite confronting, because it kind of goes from everything looking amazing on this screen, you know, whether it's your iPhone or your computer, with all of these colors and all of this brightness, going onto a fine art paper that, you know, has a heap of control, lots of different inks, lots of, you know, color gamut, how much you can produce, and then going down to, you know, what the technology that we still use for mass run printing, it's quite limited. You're going to lose a lot of vibrance. So I guess there is a, yeah, it's double-edged. It's amazing having this, 1.5 kilo, little part of yourself that there's, 1,000 copies of that, that feels incredible in a way. But then also I have to realize that those images are going to look different than they do on a screen, that they take on their own life in that format that's not necessarily as glamorous as you can display them in other ways. So yeah, it's something that's amazing, and I hope to publish more. But yeah, I'm getting prepared for and also trying to learn more about how to take that from a digital file to a large run print and still be super happy with it.
Yeah, congratulations on that project, and it
Thank
seems to
you.
just keep rolling on with reprints and
Yeah.
just the amount of coverage that it receives.
Yeah.
Now,
Thanks.
each of you is a photographer that makes a living, from that job title, and I just wonder what it is that you think distinguishes, a photographer from the rest of us, like myself, who just wields an iPhone. When without say having a degree that affords us a specific title, what is the line between being an amateur and being able to call yourself a photographer? Do you think it's when you've had something published by a certain outlet? Do you think it's when you call yourself that, or you have the equipment? I'm just curious because everyone has such different takes on this question. Maybe I can start with you, Margaret.
Yeah, I feel like similarly to most things, it's whether you practice it, right? Like you're not any more or less a photographer just because you've been published in a certain type of publication, or just because you own a camera. I think it's definitely an ongoing process. I don't think any artist of any visual format has ever had like the tipping point of making it per se. You're constantly evolving, and as you grow as a person, or as you get more access to traveling to different places, or perhaps being limited as we have been in this year, and you're finding yourself more and more challenged to find your tone and your signature within different confined environments. I think it's an ever evolving process. And I'll be honest, with stills photography, I go through phases of falling in and out of love with it, where when I've had a long period of working on motion, and it's extremely frustrating and very details intensive process, it's so refreshing to be able to come back to stills photography to capture moments that allow for interpretation of the viewer, and it's really about your relationship with your audience in a very indirect way. And so, yeah, I think it's definitely an evolving thing. I don't think there's a line or a box that you have to fit into to be able to call yourself a photographer.
Yeah. And what do you think, YK? I mean, when did you consider yourself, in your own mind, and your own sort of critical thinking of yourself, think that you were a photographer and you'd surpassed that sort of point of being someone that dabbled with the art form?
Yeah, I agree with Margaret in terms of like there's really no like hard line on who is a photographer. That there really isn't like on paper, but everyone can be a photographer nowadays. So I guess it all boils down to the essence of what makes you a photographer. So if you're getting new clients and they trust you, and you're commissioned to do some work, then you have a responsibility, and you have to execute that, to further elevate your portfolio. So that all of that is part of the process, I would say, in being just someone who just has a camera and just shoots for fun. You have you have something that a responsibility that you have to take. So if you ask me like what is the difference between both, it's probably some when the outside sources start coming to you, and you have some certain authority to and also responsibility to safely to not destroy your reputation.
Yeah, I love that answer. And for you, Tom, what do you think?
Ooh, it's a spicy question.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me, I got some business cards printed that said photographer. I was terrible. I don't think anyone should have hired me at that point. But that was a turning point for me. Much harder for me to be able to identify as an artist, because I guess I had some kind of imposter syndrome around that. So. Photography is a really interesting industry. Like Margaret said, there's no barriers to entry. I mean, there wasn't when I started, and that kind of required getting an SLR. But nowadays, you can, have a career based on your iPhone. So, because of that, I think it's kind of dangerous and a bit bourgeois to set too high a bar, because I think it's really great that it is open to everyone. And if you can take a photo, share a photo that makes people feel something, or that makes a client want to hire you, I think you're a photographer.
Yeah, and actually that's a nice way to segue into my last question, which was a very broad and common question, I guess. But what is it that makes a great photograph? And you said just now, if you can take a photo that makes people feel something, do you think it is that emotional element that makes a photo special, as opposed to just an image of something that's happened?
I'm also a sucker for composition. You can take a photo of absolutely nothing, but if the lines all just make my brain happy, then I'm good for that too. But that's a really hard question. I think everybody applies their own criteria of their life, of what their training is, of what they are moved by, of what the art forms that they love, of what references that it reminds them of. I think, I think it's really in the eye of the viewer. And I think, like Margaret's been referring to, I think that's a really good point, that photography leaves a lot of space for interpretation, whereas some other art forms maybe try and take the viewer there, or kind of have a final answer. But I think, if somebody looks at a photo and thinks it's great, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Also, if someone wants to look at it again, I think a great photo just doesn't age, right? You come back to it and maybe you notice something you didn't notice before, or it evolves with you. Like you could come back to it 2 years later and look at it, and it makes you feel something different than what you saw the first time, or you want to do a double take or something like that. I think, the ageless photos that, the most famous photographs and even paintings and stuff, it's all the same, where people keep coming back to them regardless of what the trend is in lighting, or the trend is in a return to 35 mil or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. What do you think, YK? What would your answer be to that question?
Yeah, I was thinking about all those answers, and then now all of you answer all of that. But just to add to being timeless and also having to evoke a certain feeling, I think also it has to, as Tom said, everyone has different perception. So like great photographs, I guess also has to get that initial spark to the viewer, and makes him or her curious. Not now, but maybe 30 minutes later, 2 years later. That makes them, like what Margaret said, look back. It has to have all these elements. I guess if not, it'll be washed away so quickly by the current social media with millions of photos flooding every second.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, I wanted to thank you all for being part of this discussion. There's so many elements to it. I feel like we could go on so many different tangents, and and debate so many different aspects of it. But I'm super glad that we started this conversation and can pass it over to the viewers to explore further. So thank you, Tom, Margaret, and YK for sharing all of your ideas and inspiration.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Pleasure.
See you guys.
And I just want to let our viewers know as well that, of course, there's a host of other interviews and performances and talks here at Esquire Neighbourhood. So don't leave, stay around, and we hope you're inspired as much as we are. So thanks very much.